Don't try to live someone else's life. You're someone with dreams, with ambition. You want to improve your life in every area. And you begin that journey by searching for options, methods, ways to grow, boost productivity, manage your time, take control, achieve more, and move closer to success. After a while, you start consuming a lot of what's considered valuable content. Books, podcasts, articles, interviews with successful people. You hear how they build their lives, how they optimize themselves, and you absorb it all. And honestly, those insights do make sense to you. From there, you learn a whole set of familiar productivity principles. Eat the frog, the 2-minute rule, breaking big goals into smaller tasks, along with countless other strategies meant to improve efficiency. On the surface, everything feels logical, especially when you reflect on your own procrastination. It all seems to fit. Take the famous idea from Brian Tracy. If your job is to eat a frog, do it first thing in the morning. And if you have to eat 2 frogs, eat the biggest one first. If you've never heard of it, the idea is simple. Start your day with the hardest task. Because once you get through it, everything else feels easier. In theory, it's almost perfect. And because you understand it, you believe you should be able to apply it and become more productive. But then, reality plays out differently. For some reason, you know a lot, you understand everything, but you just can't seem to apply it to your own life. You see these methods working for other people, but not for you. So you try something else, and then something else again, but the result stays the same. And slowly, a dangerous belief starts to form. Maybe I'm just not someone who can actually apply these things. After failing again and again, you begin blaming yourself. Because clearly, these methods come from successful people, and if they worked for them, then the methods must be right, which means the problem must be you. Bit by bit, your motivation fades. You start believing that self-improvement or becoming more effective just isn't for you. That it's a gain for disciplined people, people who keep promises to themselves. And you're not one of them. You can't even follow through on your own plans. So how could you ever talk about success? But the truth isn't that simple. There are many reasons why productivity systems don't work for you. And like I mentioned in my video, The Lazy Yet Ambitious Person, I started realizing that a lot of adults are quietly struggling with the same thing. The issue may not be willpower or discipline. It may be the way your brain is wired. One possibility that often gets overlooked is ADHD. ADHD is a neurodevelopmental condition that directly affects how the brain regulates attention, controls behavior, and manages energy. In reality, adult ADHD goes undiagnosed in about 50% to 66% of cases. The symptoms often begin in childhood and carry into adulthood, but many people are never formally diagnosed. In the US alone, around 4.4% of adults, nearly 10 million people, are living with ADHD. The problem is, when it's not identified early, most people don't even consider it as a possibility. They just see themselves as not good enough, not disciplined enough, not like everyone else. Meanwhile, research shows that around 40% of adults who meet the criteria for ADHD report lower quality of life and often struggle with productivity, especially in work environments. And maybe after hearing something like this, there's a tendency to start self-diagnosing, either for yourself or even for others. based on a few signs you've come across somewhere. But it's important to pause here, because understanding yourself is not about labeling too quickly. It's about looking deeper, more honestly, and with the right kind of awareness. But jumping to conclusions like that can easily lead you to misunderstand yourself. So if you notice persistent patterns like difficulty focusing, chronic procrastination, trouble controlling behavior, or clear struggles in work and daily life, then instead of self-diagnosing, consider reaching out to a mental health professional or a doctor for a proper, evidence-based evaluation. And even if you are diagnosed with ADHD, that's okay. The purpose of this video is to help you understand yourself more clearly, so you can find approaches that actually work for you, instead of forcing yourself into standards that were never designed for you in the first place. And if this resonates with you, don't forget to support the message. Like and share this video so it can reach others who may also be struggling in their own dark corner. Have you ever heard the story of a teacher who once looked at a 6-year-old boy and said he would never succeed? That boy was Michael Phelps, diagnosed with ADHD, and later recognized as the greatest Olympic athlete of all time. As a child, he couldn't sit still, couldn't focus, and even had a nurse come into class daily to give him medication in front of his classmates. But 20 years later, that same person went on to win 28 Olympic medals, 23 of them gold, more than any athlete in history. ADHD didn't hold him back. In some ways, it became part of the foundation for his success. And maybe that's what we need to reconsider. People with ADHD are not broken. They're wired differently. They can learn faster, think more broadly, be more creative, but only when they're in the right environment. Let me offer you another way to see this. Imagine your brain isn't malfunctioning. It's just running on the wrong kind of fuel. And once you change that fuel, you may start progressing in ways you never expected. And before we go deeper, I want to be clear. I don't have ADHD, but I've gone through periods where I could feel something similar. I noticed there was always something pulling me away without my control. Social media or those fake productivity tasks, like constantly checking email. I'd start my morning intending to work seriously, telling myself I'd scroll just a little to wake up. And before I knew it, an hour was gone. I was still sitting in front of the screen, but the most important work hadn't even been touched. I knew exactly what I needed to do, but I couldn't start. Or I couldn't stay focused long enough to finish. The result? Delays. Missed deadlines. Even though, in theory, the work wasn't that hard. And the key point is, I don't even have ADHD, yet I still experienced that pattern. Now imagine if your brain worked like that every single day. Not just occasionally, not just with social media, but across every part of your life. Most people think ADHD is just about attention, but in reality, it's much more complex. It's about how energy is distributed and activated, and that subtle difference changes everything. William Dawson, who has spent decades studying adult ADHD and working with thousands of cases, came to an important conclusion. ADHD is not a lack of attention. It's a different kind of attention. What he means is this. There are fundamentally two types of nervous systems. Neurotypical individuals tend to operate based on importance. They do things because they know it matters, because there are goals, consequences, expectations. But for people with ADHD, their brains don't respond strongly to importance. They respond to something else entirely. And that's where everything begins to change. Neurotypical individuals can push themselves to do something simply because they know it's important. They study because grades matter. They finish reports because deadlines matter. For them, what should be done is enough to generate motivation. Even if it's not interesting, it still works. But for people with ADHD, the nervous system operates differently. It runs on interest. They can't just force themselves to care about something simply because it's important, not because they're lazy, not because they don't care, but because the way their brain converts importance into action is fundamentally different. This is a structural issue, not an attitude problem. And this is the question William Dawson often asks his patients. If you could truly focus and sustain that focus, is there anything you couldn't do? And the answer he hears is almost always the same. If I could get into that state, I could do anything. Which suggests this isn't simply a disorder. It's a brain operating on an entirely different fuel system. Think of it like two types of engines. One's like a regular motorbike. You just put in the right gasoline and it runs steadily. That's like the brain of someone who can work simply because something is important. The other is like a jet engine. It doesn't run on regular fuel. If you give it the wrong fuel, it just sits there looking broken. Even though every part inside is perfectly fine, it's just not getting what it needs. But once you give it the right fuel, it can produce power far beyond what you ever imagined. That's how an ADHD brain works. William Dawson describes the fuel sources that activate it: interest, passion, novelty, competition, time pressure, and urgency. When a task taps into those elements, someone with ADHD can focus intensely, sometimes even outperforming others. But when a task doesn't activate any of those triggers, the brain almost shuts down. That's why a child might struggle to read for 10 minutes, but can play video games for 6 hours straight. Or why an employee might procrastinate on a boring report, but stay up until 3 a.m. working on a personal project they genuinely care about. This isn't a willpower problem. It's a nervous system driven by interest, working exactly as it's designed to. And unfortunately, most people on the outside will just say, "Try harder." But that advice is like pouring gasoline into a jet engine. It will never work. So instead of trying harder, maybe what you actually need is not more effort, but the right fuel. And I'm going to share with you a very simple system to help you identify exactly what kind of fuel your brain needs to function at its best. But first, you need to understand something even more important. Why do current systems always seem to work against you? If your brain operates differently, why does the world keep giving you tools that don't fit? The answer is simple. Because the system was never built for you. For most of human history, there were no classrooms, no desks, no standardized tests. There was only a vast world and the pressure to survive within it. And interestingly, many traits that helped humans survive back then look very similar to what we now call ADHD. Being easily distracted was actually the ability to constantly scan the environment. A hunter who ignored a small sound could lose their life. Impulsivity was the ability to make split-second decisions. Hesitating for even a moment could mean losing the prey. Restlessness wasn't a flaw. It was the drive to move, explore, and search for new resources. Because if you didn't climb the next hill, your tribe might not survive. In other words, many traits associated with ADHD were once clear survival advantages for hundreds of thousands of years. But everything began to change when humans entered the agricultural era. Survival no longer depended on hunting and adapting to constant change. It depended on farming, doing the same work on the same land over and over again through seasons and cycles. The farmer's brain required patience, stability, and the ability to sustain long-term routines, while the hunter's brain thrived on stimulation, novelty, and variation. These are essentially two different operating systems, and it's not hard to see which one the modern world is built around. Schools, offices, standardized tests, all of them favor minds that perform well under repetition and long-term discipline. And so, when hunter-type individuals are placed into that system, they are often labeled as having a problem. In 2008, researchers studied the Arial people in Kenya, one of the few communities still living between nomadic and settled lifestyles. They identified a gene variant closely associated with ADHD traits. Interestingly, Arial men who lived a nomadic lifestyle and carried this variant were actually healthier and more resilient. Their constantly active, novelty-seeking minds were perfectly suited for a life of movement, exploration, and adaptation. However, when those same individuals shifted into a settled lifestyle, they began to struggle. Their brains still craved stimulation, but the repetitive nature of daily life no longer provided it. The same gene, the same brain, but completely different outcomes. The only variable that changed was the environment. And that alone is enough to challenge the idea that ADHD is inherently a flaw. It becomes a problem only when placed in the wrong environment. In today's world, a child with ADHD tendencies may receive tens of thousands of negative messages growing up, being told they're lazy, that they need to try harder, that something is wrong with them. Over time, those messages don't just describe behavior, they shape identity. If you were that child, you might grow into adulthood no longer believing you simply struggle with focus or productivity. You might believe there's something fundamentally wrong with who you are. But the truth is, there's nothing wrong with the structure of your brain. What doesn't fit is the environment you've been placed in. And perhaps the real issue is this. You carry the identity of a hunter, but you're living in a world designed for farmers. So the deeper question becomes, what happens when that same brain, with all its structure and potential, is finally given the kind of fuel it truly needs? This is where things begin to flip everything you thought you knew. The ADHD brain tends to have lower baseline levels of dopamine, a neurotransmitter directly tied to attention, motivation, learning, and memory. At first glance, that seems like a disadvantage. But it's more complex than that. Neurotypical individuals have enough baseline dopamine to keep going, even through boring or repetitive tasks. In other words, they have enough fuel to continue without interest. But for someone with an ADHD brain, it's completely different. When a task becomes monotonous and lacks stimulation, dopamine levels drop significantly, and the brain almost enters a sleep-like state. You might find yourself staring at a page, reading the same paragraph over and over, and nothing actually sticks. But when the right kind of stimulation is present, dopamine doesn't just increase, it surges. In those moments, the brain can become an incredibly powerful engine of focus. Time seems to disappear. You forget to eat. You don't even hear your name being called. The outside world fades away. This state is known as hyperfocus. And interestingly, research shows that people with ADHD experience it more frequently than neurotypical individuals. The gap between "I can't even start" and "I'm completely locked in" is much wider in the ADHD brain. And that very gap can become a hidden advantage. At the same time, the ADHD brain often has weaker working memory. On the surface, that sounds like another disadvantage. You may struggle to hold multiple pieces of information at once or remember detailed instructions. But this limitation forces adaptation. Instead of juggling dozens of small details, you learn to extract the essence, to identify patterns, to see what truly matters. You stop focusing on individual trees and start seeing the entire forest. David Neeleman once shared that his greatest strength was the ability to simplify complex information into clear, actionable solutions. And that ability didn't exist despite his ADHD, but because of it. Statistics also reveal that around 29% of entrepreneurs show ADHD traits, compared to only about 4 to 11% in the general population. That's not a coincidence. It reflects a system designed to thrive under certain conditions. You already have the wiring. You already have the engine. But for that system to perform at its best, it needs the right environment. The truth is, ADHD is not a deficiency. It's a different way the brain operates. And the goal is not to fix it, but to design your life in a way that maximizes its strengths. The first step is to accept your weaknesses instead of constantly fighting them. I once read a story from a Japanese psychiatrist about a child with ADHD who kept losing erasers at school. Instead of scolding or punishing the child, the parents simply accepted that losing erasers was part of the pattern. They just kept buying new ones and reassured the child that it was okay. That small shift removed shame, tension, and conflict. Losing an eraser became normal, and once the guilt disappeared, confidence began to grow, spreading into other areas of life. And if you didn't receive that kind of understanding growing up, you can start giving it to yourself now. Let go of the rigid idea of normal that society imposes, the idea that you must be a certain way, perform a certain way. You have every right to question that. There is no single absolute standard of normal. If you've tried hard but still forget things, still run late, still lose items, still feel disorganized, then allow that to be part of your reality for now. Don't treat these as character flaws or proof that something is fundamentally wrong with you. Don't turn your struggles into evidence against yourself. Instead, see them as signals that you need a different approach. And from there, shift your focus toward your strengths, rather than becoming trapped in an obsession with your weaknesses. This is also something Elon Musk has pointed out. Not by trying to become someone without weaknesses, but by building the game around what you do best. Although he has never been formally diagnosed, Musk has openly shared that he has Asperger's syndrome, a form of high-functioning autism. When you look into his life, you can clearly see traits often associated with it: difficulty with social interaction, highly specific interests, and an intense level of focus on what captures his attention. What's important here is not the label itself, but how he chose to respond to it. Instead of trying to fix his weaknesses to become average, he chose to maximize his strengths to an extraordinary level. And that's the core principle when it comes to ADHD. Not to become like everyone else, but to become exceptional in a domain that truly fits who you are. That's why the most important thing is to identify your strengths and go deep into them. You need to find something you genuinely enjoy or have a natural inclination toward. If you have ADHD, following traditional paths that society often recommends may not always be the optimal choice. Instead, you should lean into what naturally pulls your attention, what you can't stop thinking about. Yes, that path can be risky. But for someone with ADHD, it's often not just an option. It's the most viable path. Because spending 8 or 9 hours a day on something that doesn't interest you is almost impossible to sustain long term. Not due to a lack of discipline, but because your dopamine system operates differently. What society calls a stable life, doing a job you don't enjoy consistently, can, in many cases, become the very environment that drains you. It may work for some people, but not for everyone. And if it truly worked for you, you probably wouldn't be struggling this much. So instead of forcing yourself into a mold that was never meant for you, the real task is to find the right environment, one where you can actually thrive. Think about Michael Phelps, the boy many adults once tried to fix. At 7 years old, his mother took him to a swimming pool. He wasn't afraid of water. He was afraid of putting his face underwater. So they taught him to float on his back first, keeping his face above the surface. He was able to move without fighting his fear. And in that water, for the first time, he felt in control. The structure of the pool transformed his chaos into strength, and the water set him free. That same brain that struggled in the classroom later became the foundation of one of the greatest athletes in history, earning 28 Olympic medals. And that story isn't an exception. David Neeleman once struggled to focus in school, feeling stuck in subjects like statistics, yet later went on to build multiple airlines, including JetBlue, one of the fastest-growing companies of its time. When asked whether he would trade his ADHD for a normal brain, he said no, because he feared losing what made him who he is. This pattern appears again and again: failure in academic environments, being labeled as problematic, and then, once placed in the right environment, they thrive. Because the real world doesn't operate like a classroom. It rewards creativity, adaptability, boldness, and fast response. These are natural strengths of ADHD. Meanwhile, classrooms often prioritize compliance, patience, repetition, and stillness. Things that go against how this kind of brain works. It's like asking a fish to climb a tree, and when it can't, concluding that something is wrong with it. So what you truly need to do is not fix your brain, but redesign your environment. Find the right fuel for it. If textbooks make you lose focus, don't force yourself into them. Instead, shift toward documentaries or more visual content. If lectures feel too boring, look for debates or opposing perspectives. The information itself doesn't change, only the way you engage with it does. Don't study by sitting still for hours like a farmer. Learn like a hunter. Rotate between topics, follow your curiosity, and allow yourself to drop things that drain your energy. In fact, research shows that this kind of rotation can improve long-term retention, and your brain has likely known this all along. At the same time, deliberately create urgency. Set a 30-minute timer and give yourself a challenge. I have to understand this before time runs out. Or tell someone you'll explain it to them tomorrow. This kind of brain responds strongly to risk and deadlines. So instead of avoiding them, learn to use them intentionally.
Also, don't wait for motivation before you begin. Act first. Even 20 to 30 minutes of intense physical movement can stabilize dopamine levels for hours afterward. And the moment you stop, sit down and start working immediately. Don't check your phone, don't interrupt that flow of energy. Once you enter a focused state, take full advantage of it. It may last for hours. And when that interest fades, allow yourself to switch to something else. That's not a lack of focus. It's how you build a kind of multidisciplinary mastery. Figures like Leonardo da Vinci weren't easily distracted. They were endlessly curious, and that curiosity made them some of the most creative minds in history. Understanding these methods doesn't mean you'll apply them perfectly tomorrow. As William Dawson explained, ADHD isn't a disorder. It's a second nervous system, one that works perfectly, but by completely different rules. You've spent your life trying to follow someone else's system, but maybe it's time to build your own. That means placing yourself in an environment that actually rewards how your brain works. Traditional environments often punish these traits. They demand consistency, repetition, predictability, and strict processes. But your mind is wired for novelty, experimentation, and a constant stream of ideas. And that's the problem. Most environments aren't designed to harness that. Even if you love the work, if the environment doesn't stimulate or recognize you, you'll eventually burn out. Not because you lack ability, but because you're in the wrong setting. You need a space where creativity is valued, where non-linear thinking is an advantage, where organized chaos is accepted, where you're judged not by how well you follow rules, but by what you create. This isn't just about following your passion. It's about recognizing obsession. For most people, interest doesn't reach that extreme. But for someone with ADHD, when obsession appears, it can take over completely. So the goal isn't balance or perfection. It's to find that point of strength, the thing that triggers that deep level of engagement, and pour your energy into it. Stop wasting energy trying to eliminate weaknesses that may never disappear. Every moment you spend fighting your weaknesses is energy taken away from your strengths. With ADHD, the goal isn't to hide flaws and become good enough. It's to maximize strengths to an exceptional level. Because in reality, you'll rarely be well-rounded. The people who succeed are those who go all in on what they do best and push it far beyond average. And yet, there's a paradox. Many of these individuals struggle with basic tasks, paying bills, doing taxes, even washing dishes. Their personal lives can feel chaotic, but their strengths are so outstanding that society overlooks those gaps. For many with ADHD, success isn't just a goal. It becomes a kind of permission to be themselves. It may sound harsh, but in a world built on shared standards, the fastest way for differences to be accepted is to prove their value. Think of minds like Leonardo da Vinci or Albert Einstein. Their unusual habits, unconventional thinking, and nonconformity weren't just accepted, they were celebrated. Not because they were normal, but because they were exceptional enough to redefine what normal even means. You may have seen this even in everyday life. As a child, maybe you couldn't sit still in class, couldn't focus like others. But if your results were still good, people would say, "That's just your way." But if your performance dropped, those same behaviors suddenly became problems to fix. There's a blunt truth many people hear growing up. Because you're different, you have to succeed.
If you're only slightly different without standing out, you're often pressured to conform. But if your difference becomes extraordinary and you succeed, then that difference becomes your identity. It may not feel fair, but that's often how the system works. Until you prove value, difference is seen as a flaw. Once you do, it becomes a strength. So instead of trying to be normal, a more realistic path is to understand how you operate, leverage it, and build a life where your strengths are so strong they overshadow your weaknesses. What you once saw as flaws may actually be signs of potential. Chaos, placed in the right context, can become creativity. Impulsivity, when directed, can become decisive action. And yes, being different can feel isolating, because most people don't think, feel, or operate the way you do. But what changes everything is finding a domain where you create real value. Once that happens, you no longer need to constantly explain yourself. And that's why you rarely see someone with ADHD aiming for an average life. They tend to push for something bigger, even if it comes with struggle. The truth is, you can't win by playing someone else's game. The sooner you accept that you're in a different system, the sooner you can learn to use it instead of fighting it. And if right now you're thinking, this makes sense, but I don't know what my strengths are, or I don't have a clear passion, then that's your starting point. It's not that you don't have passion, you just haven't explored enough. Every new experience teaches you something about yourself, your strengths, your limits, your tendencies. If you can't name 3 things you're good at and 3 things you struggle with, then you're still in the discovery phase, and that's okay. Try something creative. Build something from scratch. Learn a new skill. Start a project. Do something that scares you. Because when someone with ADHD finds the right thing, it doesn't grow slowly. It jumps from 0 to 100 almost overnight. It takes over your attention, your energy. You can't ignore it. So don't see searching as failure. The only real failure is stopping the search. And when your attention shifts, don't feel guilty. That's not inconsistency. It's how your system works. You may have tried 10 different hobbies and dropped them, but that process itself is progress. It's how you move closer to what truly fits. And yes, it can feel harsh, but often difference is only accepted when it creates value. Without that, you may be seen as unstable or incapable. But from another perspective, that also gives you freedom. The freedom to stop pretending, to stop forcing yourself into someone else's mold. And the good news is, there has never been a better time for people like you. The internet has democratized everything: knowledge, opportunity, audience, income. You're no longer limited by where you start. Even if English isn't your first language, even if you didn't go to an international school or live in a developed country, you can still learn, connect, and create value globally. Remote work is becoming standard. The creator economy rewards exactly what you do best: originality, unique perspectives, and the ability to see what others don't. As society's overall attention span declines, the very traits that once made you feel problematic are becoming advantages, but only if you stop playing by their rules. Start with a simple question. What puts you into a state of deep focus? What makes you lose track of time? What can you do for hours without feeling forced? That's not random. That's a signal. And your job is to follow it. At the same time, accept reality. You may forget things, run late, struggle with basic tasks. But that doesn't mean you need to fix yourself the traditional way. Instead, design your life around how your brain works. Build systems, environments, and habits that support you, rather than forcing yourself into ones that don't. Some people were lucky enough to receive that acceptance early in life. If you weren't, you can give it to yourself now. Because the truth is, you were built to be drawn in, to see patterns, to connect dots others miss, to focus intensely or not at all. And that intensity, placed in the right context, can become your greatest strength. The biggest lie you've been told is that you need to fix yourself to succeed. The truth is the opposite. You don't need fixing. You need building. Build an environment that matches how your brain works. And if you've stayed with me this long, thank you for being willing to explore the deeper parts of your mind, because it's only by walking through the darkness that you truly begin to understand the light.